This move opens lines for the queen and bishop, aiming to control the center and prepare for queenside expansion or development. This move initiates a flexible setup, often leading to defenses like the queen's gambit declined or the French defense, aiming to control central squares and prepare for pawn breaks later in the game. This move boldly stakes a claim in the center, aiming to develop a pawn majority that can dominate the board. This move, 2, d5, immediately challenges white's central pawn and aims to open lines for piece activity, leading into a queen's pawn game or potentially the robust French defense depending on white's subsequent play. This move develops a knight towards the center, reinforcing white's control over key squares and preparing for potential pawn advances or further piece development, typical of an attempt to secure a central space advantage in many queen's pawn openings. This move enters the classical variation of the queen's gambit declined, where black challenges white's central pawn by developing their knight to a natural square, preparing to recapture on e4 if white exchanges. This move, 4, bg5, directly challenges black's knight on f6, preparing to exchange it if black is not careful, which could lead to a weakened kingside pawn structure for black. This move, black's b-flat 4, initiates a common variation of the queen's gambit declined, specifically the Rogozin defense, by pinning white's knight and challenging white's central pawn structure. This move resolves the tension in the center, opening lines and creating opportunities for pawn activity while potentially leading to a queen's gambit declined structure. This captures the pawn, maintaining material equality while centralizing the queen and preparing for kingside development. White removes black's powerful bishop, disrupting the queen's influence and preparing to exploit the doubled pawns that will arise after. Black recaptures. This recapture creates a doubled f-pawn for black, weakening the kingside pawn structure but opening the g-file for potential counterplay. This move activates the queen to a central attacking square, simultaneously preparing to castle queenside and pressuring black's weakened kingside pawn structure. This move seeks to exploit the doubled f-pawns by creating attacking threats along the a5-e1 diagonal, while also preparing to castle kingside and develop further. Developing the knight to e2 supports the e4 pawn and prepares for kingside castling while also keeping the f3 square free for another piece, typically the queen. This move reinforces the central pawn and prepares to develop the kingside knight to a more active square, potentially to c5 or f5, to challenge white's bishop on g5. This move prepares to reroute the knight to a more active square, potentially c2 or e3, after black's queen retreats from the queenside, while also safeguarding the c1 square from any immediate threats. The knight repositions to the queenside, aiming to occupy the central c4 square and potentially support a queenside pawn advance or attack the weak c3 pawn. This move repositions the knight from a less active square to one where it influences the queenside, and prepares to support a potential kingside attack. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, aiming to pressure white's queenside and potentially exploit the weakened kingside structure created by white's pawn capture. This move prophylactically addresses the threat of na4, which would harass the bishop and potentially win material if white isn't careful. Black correctly simplifies the position by exchanging queens, which avoids facing white's coordinated pieces and aims to capitalize on white's slightly awkward knight placement. Kinging the pawn allows black to create a passed pawn on the c-file, but white gains important central control and avoids further pawn weaknesses. This move develops the bishop, preparing to castle kingside and connect the rooks, while also providing crucial defense for the e6 pawn. This move aims to exploit the weakened dark squares on black's kingside after the pawn structure has been compromised, potentially leading to tactical opportunities or positional pressure. This move addresses the immediate threat of the bishop check by creating a pawn barrier, but it allows white to gain central control and potentially target the weakened kingside pawns. The bishop retreats to a safer square, maintaining an active diagonal while preparing to redeploy and support potential pawn advances in the center. This move develops the bishop to a square where it supports the knight's potential advance to c5 and helps prepare kingside castling, while also potentially eyeing the a4 square for defense. The knight's active repositioning to c5 challenges black's pawn structure and aims to gain control of key central squares, potentially leading to tactical skirmishes or positional advantages. Castling queenside here establishes a pawn chain with the d-pawn advanced, preparing for potential pawn storms and king safety on the opposite flank from white's king. This capture removes black's active knight, disrupting their coordinated defense of the queenside and weakening the d6 pawn structure after potential pawn advances. Recapturing with the rook stabilizes the pawn structure on the queenside and prepares to contest the open d-file for future play. Developing the knight to its natural square prepares for kingside castling and reinforces the central pawn structure by offering support to the d4 pawn. This move aims to destabilize white's center by attacking the d4 pawn, creating potential pawn breaks and opening lines for black's pieces, which is a typical strategic goal in this pawn structure. This capture opens the d-file for your rook and aims to exploit black's slightly awkward pawn structure after the doubled f-pawns. The recapture of the pawn with the bishop re-establishes black's central pawn presence, creating a more symmetrical pawn structure and developing an active piece. The king cautiously retreats to a safer square, centralizing for potential endgame play while preparing to contest the d-file. This move begins to challenge white's central pawn control and aims to activate the kingside, but it weakens the kingside pawn structure and opens the f-file for white's rooks if they can penetrate. This move prepares to support the kingside pawns and potentially create attacking chances along the g-file while defending against black's increasingly active pieces. This move challenges white's rook on g1 and aims to create attacking chances on the kingside by opening lines and potentially creating a passed pawn. This move (g3) aims to reinforce the kingside pawn structure and prepare for potential future pawn advances or provide an escape square for the king on g2, while also potentially challenging black's control of the kingside. The knight's maneuver to d5 aims to challenge white's pawn structure and potentially exploit weaknesses created by white's king's exposed position. This move attacks the knight on d5, aiming to exploit the open c-file and potentially disrupt black's pawn structure if the knight is forced to move. This move centralizes the rook, preparing to contest the d-file and potentially support pawn advances or counter black's queenside expansion. This move repositions the rook to the crucial d-file, preparing to contest control and potentially create pressure against black's weakened kingside pawn structure. This pawn advance aims to gain space on the queenside and potentially challenge white's control of the queenside expansion, while also preparing to develop the queenside pieces. This move strategically repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to control key central squares and potentially prepare for future attacks on black's queenside or support white's own central pawn push. The knight repositions to f6 to support the central pawn advance and potentially the weak e4 pawn and the kingside. This rook exchange simplifies the position and activates the white rook to a more central and active square, potentially targeting black's queenside pawns or creating pressure on the d-file. This rook exchange simplifies the position and opens the d-file, which white's king must now defend, thereby limiting its mobility. This move repositions the knight to a more central and active square, aiming to control important central squares and potentially pressure black's queenside pawns or attack the king if it remains exposed. This knight maneuver neatly centralizes the piece, preparing to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king and potentially create tactical opportunities by attacking white's pawn structure. The rook moves to g2, preparing to potentially support a kingside pawn advance with g4 or to defend against black's active pieces, particularly the knight on e4, and maintain a flexible defensive structure. This pawn push aims to gain space on the kingside and potentially harass white's knight or create attacking chances by opening lines. The bishop retreats to a more active diagonal, aiming to control the central squares and potentially support a kingside pawn advance or defend against black's pawn push on h4. By capturing the pawn, black opens up the h-file, aiming to activate their rook and create attacking chances against white's king. This pawn recapture is essential to solidify the central pawn structure and prevent black from creating dangerous pawn breakthroughs on the kingside. The rook advances to the open file, creating immediate attacking potential against white's vulnerable king. This move aggressively challenges black's kingside pawn structure, aiming to open lines for white's pieces and exploit the exposed black king. This move is a tactical shot that exploits the open g-file to disrupt white's king and potentially win material or create significant mating threats. After the forcing sequence of exchanges and the king's exposure, this move is a necessary retreat to safety, allowing the king to escape the immediate threats along the g-file and the open diagonal. The rook aggressively moves to the fourth rank, seeking to exploit the exposed king and potentially create mating threats along the open file. This exchange simplifies the position by removing a central knight, leading to a more open game where white aims to exploit black's slightly compromised kingside pawn structure. This recapture opens the f-file for black's rook, creating significant attacking potential against white's vulnerable king. This move aims to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure by opening a path for white's rook to attack along the f-file and potentially create passed pawns. This move *e3** creates a passed pawn on the e-file, aiming to disrupt white's king safety and potentially create mating threats while also liberating black's bishop on e7. The knight's redeployment to d3 aims to support the central pawn push and potentially target squares on the queenside, while also preparing to recapture on f4 should the black knight move. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to control the central dark squares and potentially create threats against white's kingside pawn structure after rg8. This move aims to reinforce the d4 pawn, preventing black's active knight on e4 from gaining further central influence and preparing for a potential kingside attack. The bishop repositions to b6, eyeing the advanced pawn on c3 and preparing to potentially challenge white's control of the d-file, while also offering itself as a defensive piece for the kingside. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, preparing to potentially attack the weak pawn on f5 or support a pawn advance on the kingside. This move repositions the rook to a more active file, aiming to exploit potential weaknesses along the h-file as white's king becomes more exposed after the pawn advances. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, eyeing the weak pawn on c6 and preparing to support a potential central advance or control key. Squares in the endgame. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square on the a7-1 diagonal, potentially preparing to contest control of the diagonal or to support a pawn advance on the king side. Capturing the pawn on e3 opens the diagonal for your bishop and creates a passed pawn, a significant advantage in this endgame scenario. This pawn push aims to create an advanced passed pawn on the queenside, challenging white's knight and potentially opening lines for black's rook if white is not careful. The pawn advance g5 aims to create a protected passed pawn on g6 and restrict black's knight's scope, while also potentially opening lines for white's kingside attack. The king's desperate trek across the board is initiated, seeking a safer square and potentially repositioning to support the queenside pawn advance. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to improve its central influence and potentially support a kingside attack or defend against black's advanced pawns. The king's repositioning aims to centralize the monarch, preparing to participate in the endgame by potentially supporting pawn advances or defending key squares. This move initiates a pawn lever on the queenside, aiming to create a passed pawn by widening the space and forcing black to commit their pawns to defend. This move sacrifices a pawn to open the queenside pawn structure, potentially creating an exposed passed pawn for white after white captures. And it also aims to activate black's queenside pieces. This move activates the rook to attack the pawn on a4 and support potential advances on the kingside. This pawn push initiates a decisive attack on white's queenside, aiming to create a passed pawn or disrupt white's pawn structure. This pawn capture simplifies the position, removing a passed pawn and preparing to activate the rook on the newly opened file for potential counterplay against black's king. The advanced pawn on a3 is a significant positional weakness that black can now target by advancing the queenside pawns, aiming to create an active passed pawn. This move aims to activate the rook to the 7th rank, increasing pressure on black's queenside pawn structure and potentially supporting a kingside attack. The bishop retreats to c5, maintaining pressure on the queenside and defending the d4 pawn while repositioning for potential activity on the a7-1 diagonal. nd2 prepares to support the advance of the g-pawn and potentially control key central squares, while also offering flexibility for the knight's repositioning. This move repositions the black king towards the center, aiming to participate in the endgame action and potentially support pawn advances or defend against white's advancing pawns. Ra4 aims to consolidate white's material advantage by attacking black's passed pawn on the a-file, and potentially restricting the activity of black's a7 bishop, while also preparing to activate the rook on the open a-file if the pawn is taken. The rook's move to g1 activates it on an open file, creating threats against white's king and potentially supporting a breakthrough on the kingside. This move activates the knight, aiming to control central squares and potentially fork black's king and rook if the rook moves to a vulnerable square. The rook on g1 is now under attack, and the bishop aims to create counterplay by attacking white's pawn on a3. This rook move repositions for active play, aiming to control the 7th rank and potentially create threats against black's king or support pawn advances. This move reroutes the king to a more active central square, aiming to participate in the upcoming pawn endgame battle by supporting the a-pawn and potentially threatening the opponent's weak pawn structure. This move is a brilliant king hunt, aiming to expose the black king and force it into a vulnerable position where it can be harassed by the white pieces. With white's knight forking the king and pawn on d8, black must move the king to avoid losing material. This move aims to recapture the pawn on g4 and simplify the position. But it overlooks the immediate threat to the knight on g4 from the black pawn on e3. This move initiates a desperate king hunt, aiming to exploit the exposed white king and potentially force a stalemate or a win through perpetual check. Given the material disadvantage and lack of piece activity, the king needs to retreat to the safety of the first rank to avoid further threats from black's active pieces and potentially support a pawn advance or piece regrouping. This move repositions the rook to a more active square, aiming to pressure white's king and potentially create mating threats by exploiting the open g-file and the compromised kingside pawn structure. The white king advances to e4 to support the rook's advance and prepare for potential pawn advances. On the kingside, the rook on g1 is now actively participating in the defense of the king by reinforcing the f2 pawn, while also keeping an eye on the potential outpost on g7. The rook's move to c6 is a strategic repositioning to control the c-file, aiming to disrupt black's king safety and potentially create tactical threats against black's queenside pawns or the exposed king. The bishop retreats to c7, defending the pawn on b5 and preparing to potentially recapture on b5 if the rook is forced to move, while keeping an eye on the kingside. The rook's repositioning to a6 aims to control the a-file and prepare for potential pawn advances, or an exchange sacrifice to disrupt black's pawn structure. The black king needs to move to safety, and this square aims to connect the king with potential defenders on the queenside. The rook on a8 aims to exploit the weak pawn structure on the queenside and may seek to coordinate with the knight for a kingside attack, while also potentially trapping the black bishop. This move is a desperate attempt to create counterplay by activating the rook, aiming to use the open lines and potentially harass white's king, though the material disadvantage and white's strong central control make a successful defense unlikely. This is a powerful check that forces black's king into a more exposed position and prepares for the knight to become a dominant piece in the center or on the kingside. The king steps into a more active central square, aiming to support the remaining pawns and potentially participate in the endgame should the position simplify further. This move activates the rook to a more aggressive central file, supporting potential advances on the kingside while also preparing to capture the opponent's potentially vulnerable bishop on a7. This move is a desperate attempt to create counterplay and force checks, but it fails to address white's strong passed pawn on f3 and the superior king safety of white's monarch. The king is exposed in the center and must seek safety behind its pawns to avoid checks and potential mating threats. This move seeks to create a mating net by lining up the bishop with the exposed white king, aiming to exploit the open diagonals and the weakened pawn structure around the king. The knight on e4 now occupies a strong central outpost, pressuring black's queenside pawns and restricting the movement of the black bishop on f4, while also preparing to support a king safety maneuver. The rook now attempts to control the a-file and potentially attack black's weakened kingside pawns, while also aiming to coordinate with the knight for an endgame advantage. This move sacrifices the rook to force a favorable exchange, clearing the way for the knight to deliver mate and consolidate the advantage. This move opens up the e-file for the rook and challenges white's pawn structure, aiming to create counterplay and disrupt white's coordination. This pawn push aims to create a passed pawn on the g-file. A critical strategic objective in this endgame where material is relatively balanced but king activity is high. This check forces the white king to a less secure square, allowing black's rook to become more active and create potential mating threats. The king must retreat to safety to avoid further checks and organize a defense or counterplay. This move forces white's king to an exposed square, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially create mating threats or win material. This move forces the black king to move, allowing white to potentially recapture the pawn and simplify the position, which is generally favorable when a king is exposed. The rook on g2 is well placed to support the advance of the g-pawn or potentially swing to the king side to attack the white king if it becomes exposed. This move advances the pawn to g7, creating an unstoppable passed pawn that will promote to a queen on the next move, leading to a decisive material advantage. With white's king in a precarious position and the g7 pawn advancing, black must desperately try to create counterplay by activating the king and supporting the pawn. Advance. The knight advances to f6, aiming to support the pawn push on e5 and create a strong central outpost, while also preparing to attack the black king and potentially create a passed pawn.